Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to review a PowKiddy device. This is the RGB10X, and this is the latest really budget handheld from this company. It only costs $40. And there is no shortage of handhelds at this price point. If you just go on AliExpress, you can find some pretty decent options under 50 bucks. In fact, one could argue that there are too many options out there because it gets really hard to decide which one's going to be the best for you. Well, after messing around with this one for the past week or so, I've come away with two big takeaways. The first is that this is actually a pretty decent build when it comes to a cheaper handheld, despite the fact that it comes from PowKiddy. In fact, the quality here is much better than devices they have released previously that were twice as expensive. And the second thing is that even though this does lack some key features, including Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and HDMI, I think it would still be an excellent thing that you could give as a gift. And so we're going to break up this video into two parts. We're going to talk about what this device is, and then also what it could be. Because I think that right out of the box, it's a pretty great experience for newcomers. But at the same time, if you put some work into it, it can get even better. And so I think there's going to be a lot of stuff to talk about here. Even if you're brand new to retro handhelds or you've been around for a while, this device is actually worth discussing. Okay, let's start by going over the specs. The PowKiddy RGB10X is running the Rockchip RG35XX processor, and we've seen this in basically dozens of handhelds at this point over the past 4 years. In terms of performance, that means you can play all the way up through PS1 with relatively few problems, and it will be able to play a smattering of some of the higher-end systems like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, as well as PSP. But for the most part, I tend to treat this chip as a PS1 and below processor. Everything after that tends to be just an added bonus. We've also got a standard amount of RAM for this chipset, which is going to be 1 GB. Now the screen here is also pretty standard. It's 3.5 inches with a resolution of 640 by 480, and it has an aspect ratio of 4:3, which is pretty great for most retro systems. The battery capacity is relatively small for a device this size. It is 2800 milliamp hours. And I found over the past few days of some pretty heavy testing that gives me an average of about 4 to 6 hours of gameplay. Other than that, the experience is going to be relatively bare bones. It's going to run a custom version of Linux, and like I mentioned in the intro, it does lack some key features like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, as well as HDMI. Now you can use a USB dongle to add Wi-Fi and Bluetooth if you would like, but I think that it's better just thinking of this as an offline device. Now in terms of pricing, it's $40 plus shipping directly from the PowKiddy website. And you're probably going to be able to find it for cheaper on AliExpress as sales start to add up. And as you'll see throughout the video, that's a pretty excellent price for everything that we're getting here. Okay, so let's start with an unboxing. Now, I purchased one of these myself, the yellow one, and then also I had one sent to me for review. This is pretty common with PowKiddy. They know my name and address, and so anytime I buy something, they just throw a second one in there so I can have a color comparison. Regardless, just like with all my other videos, all opinions are going to be my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. So taking a look inside the box, it's going to be very standard PowKiddy stuff. We've got an instruction manual, the device itself, and then underneath we have a charging cable. The manual is pretty basic. It'll talk you through, some of the hotkeys and then also how to add your own games. So let's talk about the device itself. And of note, this is the gray model right here. And I also purchased the yellow one. This is the one I've been messing around with for the past few days. And the design here is pretty straightforward. We've got our D-pad up top, our face buttons, and a single analog stick. In fact, the design here is almost identical to a previous model called the RGB10, which I think this one, being the RGB10X, is modeled after. And here's a look at them side by side. And of note, my RGB10 is, about 4 years old, and it has a custom shell on it. So mine is made out of metal. It has a PS Vita stick. They were not originally like that. But unfortunately, I don't have an original model, and I'm not sure they're being made anymore either. Either way, you can see that the design is almost identical. We've got the D-pad and face buttons, that single analog stick. We even have the same menu buttons of minus and plus up here on the top, and then start and select on the bottom right. The original RGB10 also was an RK3326 device that launched in 2020. The main difference between these two is going to be the screen. This one has a 3:2 aspect ratio, whereas this one is a more traditional 4:3. Either way, you can see there is some similarity between them, but I would say the device that is probably the most similar to the RGB10X here today is the RG35XX H from Anbernic. This one launched right around the start of the new year, and you can see that yes, these are very similar just in terms of overall size and design. We'll spend more time talking about the 35XX H versus the RGB10X near the end of this video. But next, let's talk about some other first impressions, and I think the number one thing here is that it's a very lightweight and sleek handheld. You can see that it is actually relatively thin. The single analog stick is very similar to what you would find on a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con, and it's relatively flush as well, about the same distance as the D-pad. And this does make it a very pocketable handheld. I'm using shorts right here, but I think it would be fine in jeans as well. It's not to the point of what I would call a micro device, but it is still very comfortable to walk around with. It's also very lightweight. It's only 163 grams. And that's actually 20 grams less than the Anbernic RG35XX H. It is super lightweight. Let's talk about the controls, starting with the D-pad. This is a rubber membrane, so it's going to feel a lot like a classic controller. It's kind of reminiscent of a Super Nintendo D-pad. And one thing you can notice right off the bat is this D-pad is a lot bigger than others from PowKiddy and similar devices. If we compare it to the Anbernic RG35XX H, you can see that it's almost luxuriously large. And the feel of the D-pad is pretty good. It has a soft rubber kind of feel to it, even though it is hard rubber, and it also has just a little bit of travel. I would say it could be a little bit springier, but overall I don't really have many complaints. The pivot on it is also pretty good, and it does again remind me of a Super Nintendo controller, but maybe one that's a little bit more broken in. Now, when reviewing D-pads, I usually take a look at two separate games. First Contra, then Street Fighter. With Contra, I'm trying to make sure that the diagonals are not going to happen accidentally, and then with Street Fighter, I want to make sure that I can hit the diagonals when I want to. So starting with Contra here, I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And you can see if I just move it left and right a little bit, the character barely moves. However, if I try to push it a little bit further, then yes, I can move the character. And this is exactly where I want to be when it comes to this game. This means that when I want to go in a diagonal direction, I totally can, but when I don't want to, I don't have to. And so this might be one of the best D-pads from PowKiddy. It gives me a full range of motion, but no accidental movements either. And the fact that we have a larger D-pad like this just feels a lot roomier, and I feel like I have more control than with others. And when it comes to the opposite end of the spectrum, when I'm trying to hit a diagonal, like with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, it also works really well. It took me a few minutes to acclimate to the size and weight of the D-pad, but after I figured it out, yeah, it was a really great experience. I had no problems doing Hadoukens or Shoryukens. And so this might be one of the best D-pads I've seen from PowKiddy. It's nice and large, it's light to the touch, and just feels already broken in. Now, in terms of the analog stick, I would say there's no surprise here. It's just very similar to what you would find on a Nintendo Switch. And I will say that shifting from the D-pad over to the analog stick is really easy. We have a flat back here, which makes it super easy to shift your hand down when needed. And so I would say this device is most comfortable when using it with the D-pad, but the analog stick is not half bad either. Now, I'm sure there are people who would prefer to have a second analog stick, for example when playing the PS1 game Ape Escape, or maybe like a dual stick arcade game or a Portmaster game. All of those unfortunately will only have a single analog stick to use. However, I think that for the vast majority of the games that you're going to be playing, the single analog stick is going to be just fine. And so that'll be up to you whether or not that's a deal breaker compared to other devices that do have two sticks. Now on the other side we have our face buttons, and these are also larger than you would typically find on a device this size. Again, going back to the Anbernic RG35XX H, you can see that there is quite a big size difference between the two. And these buttons seem to be identical with another PowKiddy device that was released this year, the V10. This one also had some really nice big buttons, and I think they're identical between the two. The buttons have a soft matte texture to them, and they're relatively flat as well, but with some roundedness at the edges. This makes the buttons really easy to press down on, and I like the rubber membranes they're using underneath. They are just super light to the touch. And so again, much like how they were excellent on the V10, I really like them here on the RGB10X as well. Now for the rest of the face, we've got our start and select buttons here. The start button is up top like it was on the original RGB10. Then we have these two menu buttons, minus and plus. And again, this was the same on the RGB10. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of their placement. It just is a little bit unintuitive because I often will think that these are select and start. If we look at the Nintendo Switch, you can see that, yeah, select and start right here are minus and plus. And so this really throws me off every time. Generally, what I will do is I'll assign the minus button here as my hotkey, and then I'll just use start and select as normal. Looking up top, we have inline shoulder and trigger buttons, very typical of devices with this shape and size. The buttons themselves have a micro switch connection, so they're a little bit clicky, but they are actually pretty well dampened, and so I wouldn't say that these are loud. They're also easy to press down on, and so I have no complaints about this, especially for a $40 device. Also up top, we have our USB-C port for charging, then we have a reset button, our volume up and down. Of note, the volume button up is on the left side, and then finally we have our power button. Now, when it comes to the sides, we have SD card slots, so on the left side it will be for your operating system, and then on the right it'll be for an expanded storage for games. And then on the bottom we have an OTG USB-C port. This will be for peripherals. Then we have our 3.5mm headphone jack. Now, even though this device does have 2 holes on each side, I don't think it has stereo speakers. I think there's only one single speaker on the right side. We'll do a teardown to confirm, but when I'm playing a game, I can totally hear the sound on this side, but not so much on this one. And then finally on the back, we've got this nice little PowKiddy logo. I've never seen this X logo before. I actually think it's pretty neat. And when you're playing the device, your fingers are going to go over these little lines, and I think it's actually a nice little added texture, so I don't mind it at all. Of note, the plastic texture here is very similar to what you would find on other PowKiddy devices, so it's slightly matte, but also a little bit slick. It does have a bit of a cheap plastic feel to it. It feels more like a toy than like a premium device. Personally, I don't mind that, especially with something that's a cheaper device. I kind of want it to feel like a toy like it did back in the day. And the last thing worth noting about my overall impressions and the buttons and whatnot is just that it does feel a little bit cheap, all things considered. You know, it does rattle a little bit if you shake it around, and that's because the shoulder and trigger buttons are a little bit loose. So if you're looking for a super sleek and premium feeling device, I would say this is not the one for you. So now let's talk about the screen. So this is 3.5 inches diagonally, and it's 4:3 aspect ratio with a 480p resolution. And like I mentioned, this is pretty standard with a lot of these cheaper handhelds. Now, one thing you'll notice right off the bat is that the bezels on this device are relatively large. And the bezel on the bottom is a little bit wider than the others around each of the sides as well. And so that also does contribute to the cheaper feeling of this device altogether, because these bezels do stand out quite a bit. However, one thing worth noting is that the colors on this are actually pretty good, and the device gets very bright. For example, here in an outdoor condition, when playing it in the shade, I think it's just about perfect. And if we angle my camera so that it's not actually in the shade, you can see that it's very good as well. Now bear in mind, this is not in direct sunlight, so this is just in an unshaded outdoor environment. But even then, I would be more than comfortable playing in a setup like this as well. So really, when it comes down to it, for $40, I don't have many complaints about this screen. Yes, the bezels are relatively large, but really that's about it. And after doing a quick teardown, you can see that yes, there is no speaker on this side. It's only going to be on this one side underneath the battery. And so this is a mono sound device. While we're in here, you can also see that yes, this is where the battery is. It's also going to be very easy to change out the analog stick. And then of course we have our CPU and our RAM modules as well. One thing of note, this device does get warm right around where the CPU is when you play PS1 and above. And so that is one thing to keep in mind, is that when you push this CPU, it does get relatively warm. Now we actually have quite a bit of space right here, so you could put a heatsink if you could find one that fit right here, and that might actually help with the overall heat. As it stands, I don't think it's a huge deal, but if it really does bother you, there at least is enough room to work with. And I also appreciate the fact that they didn't put the battery directly over the CPU. I think that was pretty smart. Okay, let's do a quick audio test. We're going to do Streets of Rage 2 on the Sega Genesis, running at 100% volume. So first impression here is that it is relatively quiet. I think that makes sense. After all, we only have one speaker versus the standard 2. And I would say also it lacks bass, which is pretty common with the smaller handhelds. But overall, I would say that's my main impression, is that yeah, it sounds okay, but it is a little bit quiet. For my part, I think it is loud enough for most situations I would be in anyway, unless you were trying to play in a noisy room. So now that we've talked about the hardware specs, let's start talking about the software. And of note, this device does come with a 64GB card loaded already. And so there are going to be games preloaded onto this device. And while I always recommend that you should add your own games, that's usually going to give you a better experience overall, let's take a look at what it looks like when you actually first buy it. So this is running a customized version of what they call ArcOS. This is an operating system that's been around since the original RGB10. And the experience here is going to be very simple. You will just navigate through this preloaded card, then you'll select your system, and then boot up your game from here. I've been trying my best to avoid any of the Nintendo IP and systems, and so we're not going to go into those, but you can see that most of the other systems are pretty robust. But of note, I did go through the contents of this card, and I can confirm that there are many games that were removed, including those with Nintendo IP, so things like Mario and Pokemon, they have been removed from the system. And so if you are looking to play those games specifically preloaded on this device, they're not going to be there. I would recommend loading your own. But when it comes to all the other systems and the IP within there, yes, there are a ton of games here. In fact, I would say that there are too many games here. I found that when you put too many games on a card, you end up just browsing instead of actually playing. And so I've always had the opinion that you should just add your own games and curate that list to the games that you really want to play. And we'll talk about that here in a moment when we talk about some of the things you could do with this device to make it even better. Now, when it comes to performance, I would say that the heavy-hitting games all the way up to PS1 are going to play just fine. You might find a few here or there that won't play great, but Tekken 3 is an excellent example. This is one of the hardest to emulate games on this system, and it's running at full speed. Now, when it comes to systems like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, and PSP, I'm a little more reluctant to say that those games are going to be playable. For the most part, I would say it's going to be the more lightweight games that will play well on this system. About a third of the catalog should be fine. And that will include some of my favorite games like Mario 64 and Mario Kart, things like that'll be great. But just don't expect to play something like Conker's Bad Fur Day or GoldenEye 007. Those ones just really can't hack it on this chipset. And so when it comes down to it, just out of the box, I think that the RGB10X is actually a pretty nice fit. For $40, you're going to get a device that is already set up with a nice custom operating system and a bunch of games, although I do recommend curating that list a little bit better. So if you're looking for something to get started with retro handhelds, then I do think this one is a pretty good fit, especially if you want something with a horizontal form factor. Most of the other cheap devices you can find at the $40 price point are going to be vertical devices, and those are great when it comes to invoking that kind of Game Boy style nostalgia, but nothing really beats the comfort of a horizontal handheld if you ask me. However, like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we're kind of separating it by what it is and what it could be, and all of that we've talked about so far are all the things that you will get if you just buy it right now out of the box. But I think the most important part of this handheld is what you can do with it if you're willing to do a little bit of work. So the way I see it, if you first pick it up and you just want to get started, then yes, this will be fine. But after a while, if you want to see what you can do with it even more, then that's where things get really exciting. And here's the way I did it. I took my yellow RGB10X out of the box a few days ago, and then I customized it to my liking and then kept the gray one as it is like we reviewed here today. And so now this console is kind of my best case scenario compared to what you will get outside of the box. Let's break down everything that I did. First thing, I went to the ArcOS website and checked out all of the modern builds, and it turns out that they already have official support for the PowKiddy RGB10X. And so it's as simple as just going to this website, grabbing the RGB10X image file, and then flashing that to an SD card of your choice. That's going to give us the most updated version of this firmware, so that we will have the latest and greatest when it comes to performance and other tweaks. Now from there, things can get a little bit more complicated, and what I did here is I customized this operating system to my liking. I actually made an entire video about this, talking about how to set up the simplest OS possible. And this right here is the final result of that work. You can see here I can navigate through all of my games. They all have identical looking box art, and it's all going to be navigated through in just one single line. That means instead of having to go system by system, you just have to navigate through alphabetically to find your games. And there's two great things about a setup like this. Number one is that if you wanted to hand this to somebody who didn't know how to read, they could still navigate through by looking at the box art. In addition, it also reduces the overall size of your library. So I have maybe 40 or 50 games altogether, so I'm really limiting how many games I can play on this device. But that's one of the great things about this setup. I tend to play more games this way as opposed to having thousands of games on my handheld. And I'm not going to go into detail about how to set this up just because I made a whole video about it, but the idea is that you can put all your games on here, and then you set the ones you want to be your favorites. And from there, you basically remove any option to go to any other section of the device other than your favorites. And so it'll boot directly into your favorites menu, and so this is going to be your curated list. And so that allows me to curate my collection even more, and I can always add and remove those favorites as well. This setup also has a couple other neat features, like an option called Quick Shutdown. What I have to do here is press the plus button and the power button. It'll immediately turn off the device, but also save my progress right there. Now all I have to do is just press the power button again and then wait a few moments for the OS to boot up. And then after that, it'll go directly into the game and exactly where I was before I hit the power button. So this is a nice way of having a quick suspend and resume without having to resort to a sleep cycle. And even though it does take about 15 or 20 seconds to do a cold boot, I think it's totally worth it for the battery savings. Now there were a couple other things I did with ArcOS that I talk about in that other video, including like setting up my own custom hotkeys. But the other main thing that I did is I set up shaders and overlays. And the first thing I did is I updated my shaders. So I used a Wi-Fi dongle like this, then I went and I connected to my network, I went into Online Updater, and then I did Update GLSL shaders. This is going to give me the ability to use a specific shader that we'll talk about here in a moment. And I also have an entire shaders and overlay video guide. I'll have it linked down below. It's got a full written guide as well. And that guide in particular was made for 480p screens like this one, and so it's going to be a perfect fit. So if you want to learn more about shaders and overlays, I'm going to reference that video as well. When it comes to shaders, I went into the quick menu and then I went into the Pixel AA section, and then I'm using this one here, Pixel AA Fast. This is an interpolation shader that will balance out all of your pixels, and it looks really good. From there, I went into Save Preset, and I actually saved it as a global preset. That means that every system is going to use this shader. Thankfully, the shader itself is lightweight enough that it'll still allow you to play most games at full speed, so it's really not going to affect anything other than maybe some Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and so on. And the nice thing here is that it balances out the pixels really well, and it also keeps everything nice and sharp. And so I found this to be an ideal shader when it comes to low-powered systems to make sure that you have a nice balanced image. Now in that video I talk about things like CRT shaders, and you can always go that route as well, but I think that if you're just looking for a nice clean image, that's the way I would go. Now for the handheld systems like Game Boy and Game Boy Color, I went a little bit further and I actually used overlays. So here I'm using a Game Boy Color overlay, which gives a nice depth of field, as you can see, and also an LCD grid on top. And this is also using that Pixel AA shader underneath, and so everything is nice and balanced as well. I also used a similar setup with the original Game Boy using an overlay here, and again I went over all this stuff in that other shaders and overlays guide. And then finally, same thing with Game Boy Advanced. I used a nice custom overlay here which puts the bezel at the bottom, and I think it looks very nice. So here's the way I see it. Now that I've customized my ArcOS to basically cover all of my needs, and that I'm able to navigate through my system with a very nice user interface, and then also have a curated games list, and then also, overlays and shaders to fit my needs, this has become a much more elevated device than I had previously. And there are more things you can do with this handheld. For example, this is Portmaster compatible, so instead of just emulating games, I could also run native PC games too. And as you might have already guessed, I have a full guide about that too. I'll also leave that one linked down below. At the very least, you can see how much value we can squeeze out of this $40 handheld, and a lot of this is thanks to the custom firmware development that has happened over the years on the RK3326. And also bear in mind that ArcOS is not the only operating system that would work on this device as well. I just think it's probably the best match for it right now. And a lot of this has to do with that curated image that I've set up right here for my device. And at this point, I think that at $40, it makes an excellent gift for someone else who maybe doesn't have the time to set it up like this. Now, usually at this point in the video, I will make a likes and dislike list, and I'll talk about everything that's good and bad about this device and whether or not it's a good fit for you. And I think that we don't really need to do that this time around. Instead, I think the best way to kind of determine whether or not this device is a good fit is to compare it against another option which is very similar, and that's the RG35XX H. And I've covered this handheld pretty extensively, and so I'm not going to go too far into details here other than just to highlight the differences between the two. And I have to say that just in general, I think that the RG35XX H is going to be a better handheld. When it comes to performance, the chip on the 35XX H is a little bit better than the 3326, and so you'll be able to play a little bit more Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast. In addition, the H700 chipset in the Anbernic device is also widely supported, so there are many custom firmware options available. This also has Portmaster support, so you can play those PC ports on this device as well. In addition, I think that the hardware is just better. It's a little bit thinner, it's got dual analog sticks, it also has Wi-Fi and HDMI and Bluetooth. And so if you are looking for a device with more features, then I would say that the 35XX H is your better bet. But the most interesting thing about the comparison of these two is the price point. Like I mentioned before, the RGB10X is $40, and that can be a little bit cheaper and more expensive depending on where you're buying it from. On the other hand, the Anbernic RG35XX H is around $60. Again, you can find it for cheaper and more expensive. But if we just take those two baseline prices at face value, that means that the RG35XX H is 50% more expensive than the RGB10X. To put this into context, if you were planning on buying several of these devices to give away as gifts, you could buy 3 PowKiddies for the price of 2 of the Anbernics. Now, of course, that reduced price does come at a cost, especially when it comes to things like Wi-Fi and the ability to plug it into a TV. And so those features are not going to be available on the PowKiddy device. And so it's really going to come down to what specifically you're trying to find in a handheld and whether or not it's worth spending that additional $20. So I think when it comes down to it, each of these devices have their own place within the whole retro handheld scene. If you're only looking to spend $40, but you want a horizontal device that is really comfortable, I think that the RGB10X really fits that bill. And this might have some of the best controls that you can find on a handheld for $40. Meanwhile, if you're looking to have better features and maybe something a little bit thinner and sleeker, then I think that the RG35XX H is still an excellent handheld for $60. And of course, it'll go on and on depending on how much you're willing to spend, all the way up to like $200 for the Retroid Pocket Mini. You can always go that route as well, and you'll get a much better experience too. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's worth discounting just how much of a value we can get from the RGB10X. I think this is an excellent handheld for the price. Now, whether or not you're willing to spend $40 on a cheaper handheld that is going to lack some features, that's really going to be up to you and your budget. One thing I've learned about this whole retro handhelds thing is that some of these devices will be amazing for some people and total trash for others, and it's kind of crazy how that all falls out. For example, a common thing that you'll see on the internet is people saying that this thing is just not worth $40, that it's total garbage, that it's e-waste, and that you're better off just saving your money for something better. And I definitely see that viewpoint. But on the other hand, I will often get emails from people who say that they just picked up a cheap retro handheld, and maybe they were spending some time in the hospital, for example, like they were going through chemotherapy, and this thing helped them get through that. And so I don't want to discount how great a small and cheap device can be as well. In the end, when I'm talking about whether or not a device is worth it or worth that value to you, I'm usually thinking about the guy in the cancer ward as opposed to somebody who's looking for the latest and greatest. And I think in that regard, the RGB10X definitely has its own value. Yes, it's $40, yes, it's a little bit cheap, but man, I've been having a great time curating my operating system for this device. And so while it may not be a good fit for everybody, I hope I've given you enough information to determine whether or not it's going to be a good fit for you. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you think it's worth it to get a cheap $40 handheld that gets most things right, or is it worth spending an additional $20 to get some additional features? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.